How could a tank loader using a backwards technique destroy 4 Panzer tanks in September 1944 in just 6 minutes as German armor closed? A young Sherman crewman broke every rule in the manual and turned his back on a live cannon. What happened next stunned his commanders. Stay with us. This is the unbelievable story behind that moment. At 11:23 a.m. on September 19, 1944, the war shrank to the inside of a steel box. Private First Class Walter Kowalski crouched inside the turret of an M4 Sherman near Araort, France, while 3 German Panzer IVs rolled toward him from 800 yards out. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. 2 days earlier, the loader standing in that exact spot had been killed when a Panzer round tore through the turret. Walter wasn't even trained for this job. He was a mechanic, a replacement, a man who had loaded exactly 4 practice rounds in his entire life at Fort Knox. Outside, the gunner shouted about traverse speed, the commander screamed coordinates from the hatch, and the driver reversed into a hedgerow. And Walter had to load the 75mm cannon. He grabbed the first shell from the ready rack, 38 pounds of high explosive slick with oil and sweat. The method had been drilled into every loader nose. Forward line. Up the brass base with the breech, slam it home. Step clear. 4 seconds if you were good. 5 if you were nervous. But Walter was left-handed, and the Sherman turret was built for right-handed men. When he tried to turn and load the proper way, his elbow smashed into the gunner's shoulder. The gunner shoved him back. The shell nearly slipped from his grip. The commander's voice cracked overhead. "They're at 600 yards, not distance, a countdown." In that split second between panic and instinct, Walter did something no manual suggested. He turned his back to the breech, reached behind himself. His left hand searched blindly for the opening while his right gripped the shell base. His fingers found the rim. He guided the nose backward into the chamber and drove it forward hard. The breech slammed shut. The gunner fired instantly. The recoil blasted smoke and hot metal backward, scorching Walter's neck. He didn't flinch. He was already reaching for the next round. Back turned. Left hand guiding. Right hand ramming. 3 seconds. Fire. Third shell, 2.5. Fourth, 2 seconds flat. His ears rang. Cordite burned his throat. He moved on instinct now, faster than training, faster than fear. Then the commander's voice cut through the chaos. 4 impacts, 4 kills, 6 minutes of combat. Across the field, 400 yards away, German tanks burned black smoke clawing into the sky. Inside the Sherman, silence fell. Walter stood there, still facing away from the breech hands, black with powder. The gunner stared at him. The commander climbed down and looked at him like he'd just seen something impossible. Nobody loaded a 75mm cannon backward. It violated every safety protocol, every procedure written since 1942. But it worked. And in that smoke-filled turret, Walter realized something the instructors at Fort Knox had never considered. Sometimes survival doesn't come from following the manual, it comes from breaking it. What happened after that morning would ripple through every Sherman crew in Third Army. And it all began with a mechanic who turned his back on the rules and faced down 3 German tanks. What would you have done in that turret? Follow the manual or trust your instinct under fire? If this story pulled you in, hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. The M4 Sherman that Walter Kowalski served in was never designed to fight German panzers head-to-head. It was built in 1941 to support infantry, break defensive lines, move fast, and be easy to produce and repair. And produce them, they did nearly 49,000 Shermans, rolled off American assembly lines between 1942 and 1945. They were reliable, they were numerous, but they were not built for duels against Germany's heaviest armor. The problem was the gun. The Sherman's 75mm cannon could penetrate about 3 inches of armor at 500 yards, enough to destroy a Panzer III, not enough to kill a Panzer IV from the front, and nowhere near enough to punch through a Panther or a Tiger. By late 1943, German tank designers had thickened frontal armor specifically to stop Sherman shells at combat range. On paper, American doctrine insisted that 5 Shermans could overwhelm 1 Panzer through speed maneuver and flanking fire. The math looked clean. In reality, it often meant 4 out of 5 crews died trying to get into position. Tankers called it the death ratio. In France, during the summer of 1944, Allied forces sometimes lost 4 or 5 Shermans for every German tank destroyed. The battlefield proved how brutal that imbalance could be. At Villers-Bocage in June, a single Tiger destroyed 25 Allied tanks in 15 minutes. At Goodwood in July, British armored units lost 200 Shermans in one day pushing south of Caen. Crews drove past burned-out hulls on nearly every road. They pulled wounded men from shattered turrets. They watched tanks brew up when German rounds ignited ammunition stored inside. A direct hit to the turret usually killed the loader first. He stood beside the ready rack where 20 shells were stacked. When those shells detonated, there was often nothing left to recover. American commanders tried everything to even the odds. Sandbags stacked on front plates, spare track links welded to turrets, extra markings painted to mislead German gunners. But none of it solved the core problem. The 75mm still couldn't reliably penetrate German frontal armor. And in a tank duel, the crew that fired first usually survived. That meant speed mattered. Rate of fire mattered. A Sherman crew that could load and fire faster than a Panzer crew had a chance, maybe not a good chance, but a chance. The standard loading time for a Sherman 75mm gun was 4 to 5 seconds. Grab the shell from the ready rack. Turn to face the breech. Align it. Ram it home. Step clear. German Panzer IV loaders could match that pace. Panther crews were slightly slower because their shells were heavier, but their guns could destroy a Sherman from nearly twice the distance, so speed mattered less to them. At Fort Knox, instructors drilled one method relentlessly: face the breech. 2 hands on the shell ram, straight forward. It was safe, repeatable, efficient. On a quiet practice range, it worked perfectly. But there was a flaw no one at Fort Knox had considered. What if the loader was left-handed? Walter Kowalski was one of roughly 3,000 left-handed loaders in 3rd Army. No one tracked that officially. No one thought it mattered. Left-handed recruits were simply told to learn the standard method right-handed. In a stationary tank, that rule seemed fine. In combat, it cost time. Inside a Sherman turret space was brutally tight 7 feet across at its widest. The loader stood on the right side of the gun, the gunner on the left, the commander behind and above. When the gun fired, it recoiled 18 inches backward. When the turret traversed, everything shifted. A right-handed loader could pivot smoothly, align naturally with the breech and load, without colliding with the gunner. The motion flowed. A left-handed loader faced the opposite geometry. To follow the manual, he had to lead with his weaker right hand. His stronger left elbow swung wide as he turned, and in that cramped steel cage, it smashed into the gunner's shoulder, the traverse wheel, or the radio mount almost every time. The result was slower loads, 5 to 6 seconds instead of 4. Training instructors called that acceptable. On a battlefield where 1 second could decide which tank exploded, first acceptable could mean a burning turret and a crew erased from history. In combat, those extra 2 seconds weren't a statistic. They were a death sentence. At Aracourt in mid-September 1944, the 4th Armored Division lost 18 Sherman tanks in the first 2 days of fighting. Most were knocked out before they could fire a third shot. After-action reports told the same grim story. Loaders killed while wrestling with the breech shells fumbled precious seconds slipping away. One tank commander described how his left-handed loader dropped a round in the chaos. 8 seconds, just 8 were lost retrieving it. A Panzer shell tore through their turret before they could fire again. The loader died instantly. The gunner lost both legs, and the problem wasn't limited to left-handed men. Even right-handed loaders struggled when the tank was moving. Shermans had no gun stabilization system. When the tank lurched over rough French farmland, the turret shook and the breech shifted with every bump. Loaders had to time their movements perfectly with the gun's motion. Imagine trying to slam a 38-pound shell into a moving steel mouth while standing inside a vibrating metal box while someone out there was aiming to kill you. Most loaders adapted the only way they could. They grabbed the rim of the breech with one hand to steady themselves and loaded with the other. It worked barely. But that meant controlling a 75mm round one-handed. Heavy, awkward, slippery with sweat. Shells slipped, and when a loader dropped one in combat, it could take 10 to 15 seconds to recover. By then, the Panzer had already fired. Tank commanders saw it happen again and again. Good crews lost because loading took too long. Some commanders tried calling out firing solutions earlier. Others maneuvered desperately to buy their loaders more time. But there was no official fix. The manual was clear: face the breech ram, the shell forward. That was doctrine. Changing it meant breaking regulations. And in wartime, breaking regulations was not something soldiers were encouraged to do. What no one realized was that the answer had been there all along, hidden in the cramped geometry of the turret, in the awkward swing of an elbow, in the instinct of a man who simply wanted to survive. Walter Kowalski didn't set out to challenge Army doctrine. He didn't intend to innovate. He discovered his backward loading method, the only way battlefield revolutions are ever discovered, by accident and by desperation. Before we move on, take a second and tell us which city and country are you watching from right now, and what time is it there as you hear this story. Drop it in the comments so we can see how far this battlefield story has traveled across the world. On September 17, 1944, 2 days before the fight that would make him unforgettable, Walter Kowalski's Sherman was hit during a skirmish near Aracourt. A Panzer round slammed into the front glacis at an angle and ricocheted upward. The armor held, but the impact hurled Walter across the turret. His right shoulder smashed into steel hard enough to dislocate. The battalion medics snapped it back into place, and gave the verdict he was done. Finished. A loader with a ruined right arm was useless. The standard method required both arms working in perfect coordination. Walter couldn't lift 38 pounds with his right arm. He could barely move it. But 4th Armored Division was bleeding. The regiment was 12 tanks under strength. 36 loaders had been lost in a week. There were no replacements. Sergeant Raymond Miller made a decision that wasn't in any manual. Walter would stay. They would figure something out. The next morning, September 18th, German fire cracked through the fog east of Aricourt. 3 Panzer IVs emerged at 900 yards. Miller ordered the gunner to engage. Walter reached for a shell with his left hand. His right arm hung limp. He tried the standard method, faced the breach, attempted to lift with both arms. Pain exploded through his shoulder. The shell tilted, slipped. The gunner shouted. The Panzers were closing 800 yards now. Then panic became invention. Walter turned his back to the breach, reached behind himself with his left hand like a blind man searching for a door handle. His fingers brushed hot steel. He guided the shell nose backward into the chamber and rammed it home with his left arm. It felt wrong, unsafe, completely backward. The breech slammed shut. The gunner fired. Recoil blasted heat into Walter's back, searing through cloth and skin. He smelled burned fabric, but the shell was in. 3.5 seconds. He grabbed another. Same motion. Back turned. Left hand guiding. Left arm driving. 3 seconds. The Panzers fired back now. Rounds screamed past the turret. Walter kept moving. 4th shell. 5th. His left arm burned like it was tearing from the socket, but he didn't stop. The fight lasted 4 minutes. 9 rounds fired. 2 Panzers hit. The 3rd vanished behind a tree line. When silence fell, Walter's back was speckled with powder burns. His left arm trembled from exhaustion. His right still hung useless. Sergeant Miller climbed down and stared. The gunner stared too. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Miller asked, "How fast was that?" Walter hadn't counted. The gunner had. 3 seconds, sometimes less. Faster than their previous loader. Faster than anyone in the platoon, maybe the entire battalion. Miller gave a simple order. Keep doing exactly what you just did. It violated every regulation in the field manual, but it worked. The backward method succeeded for 3 reasons. The Army had never considered leverage space in natural motion. Facing the breach, a loader had to extend both arms fully to ram 38 pounds of steel forward, worst possible leverage. Any mechanic knows pushing heavy weight with straight arms drains power. But when Walter turned his back, he changed the physics. Instead of pushing forward with extended arms, he drove the shell backward with a bent arm and his body weight behind it. The motion was like throwing a punch in reverse, short, explosive, efficient. His left arm traveled half the distance. He used his shoulder and back, not just his triceps. 4 seconds became 3. Space was the second advantage. A Sherman turret was brutally tight. Facing the breach, a loader's elbows flared, wide shoulders, square to the gun, constantly colliding with the gunner or the traverse wheel. Every bump cost time. Sometimes it cost the shell. Turning his back narrowed Walter's profile. His shoulders ran parallel to the gun. He occupied barely 10 inches instead of 2 feet. The gunner had room. The commander had room. The entire crew moved cleaner, faster. And the third advantage, the most important, was something no manual could teach. It was instinct. The standard method was mechanical. Walter's backward motion was natural. His dominant left arm led the movement. His body flowed with the turret's motion instead of fighting it. In the chaos of a shaking tank under fire, he wasn't forcing himself into an unnatural posture. He was moving the way his body wanted to move. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. Sometimes it's about letting the body choose what the manual never imagined. Right-handed loaders were trained to lead with their right hand. On paper, it made perfect sense. Use your dominant hand to guide the shell control. The weight ram it straight into the breech. But inside the cramped steel belly of a Sherman turret, that logical motion forced a man to twist his torso left while reaching right. It was awkward, mechanical, and required conscious coordination. Under combat stress, when adrenaline surged and German armor was closing fast, that coordination fell apart. Hands slipped, shells fumbled, precious seconds vanished. Left-handed loaders had it even worse. They were forced to lead with their weaker hand, fighting their own instincts every time they moved. Nothing about the standard method felt natural to them. Every load was a correction. Every motion worked against their muscle memory. And in a duel where the first tank to fire usually survived hesitation was fatal. Walter's backward method erased that conflict entirely. Instead of twisting unnaturally, he reached behind himself with his dominant hand, his left. The motion wasn't taught. It wasn't practiced. It was instinctive. Under fire, when his brain was overloaded and his hands were shaking, he didn't have to think. His left hand could find the breech by touch alone, feel the rim of the opening guide, the shell home without ever looking. The movement was shorter, tighter, more efficient. And it worked not just for left-handed loaders. A right-handed man could reverse the motion and lead naturally with his right hand. But there was a dangerous truth attached to that efficiency. It violated every safety regulation written for Sherman tank crews. Army Technical Manual 9-731A was clear. Loaders were to face the breech at all times. Maintain visual contact with the shell. Use both hands in coordinated motion. Step clear of the recoil path. Turning your back on a 75mm cannon broke all 4 rules at once. Those rules existed for a reason. A loader who couldn't see the breech might misalign a round. A misaligned shell could jam the mechanism. A jammed breech in combat meant a silent gun, and a silent gun meant a dead tank. The manual even cited cases from North Africa where improper loading had led to catastrophic breech failures, in one instance, an explosion that killed the entire crew inside. Sergeant Raymond Miller knew those regulations. He understood the risks, but he also knew what he had just witnessed inside that turret, a wounded mechanic loading faster than anyone in the platoon, maybe anyone in the battalion. After the September 18th engagement, Miller faced a decision that would never appear in any field manual report: the violation and lose his most effective loader, or keep quiet and give his crew a better chance to survive the next fight. He chose survival. He said nothing. Before we continue, take a moment and tell us, did anyone in your family serve in World War II? And if so, which country did they fight for? Share their story in the comments so their memory lives on. On September 19th, the engagement that opened this story, Walter's crew destroyed 4 Panzers in 6 minutes using the backward loading method. In a battalion that had been losing 2 tanks for every one it destroyed, results like that spread fast. Commanders notice when someone beats the odds. By September 23, other loaders were quietly trying Walter's technique. By September 21, 8 were doing it. No formal approval, no paperwork. They simply turned their backs to the breach during combat and started surviving. The difference was impossible to ignore. Crews using the backward method were firing 9 to 10 rounds per engagement instead of 6 or 7. They were landing killing shots before German tanks could respond. Survival rates climbed. 4th Armored Division's brutal 4-to-1 loss ratio began moving towards something closer to even. The method spread the way battlefield innovations always do, through whispers, quick demonstrations behind maintenance sheds, loaders teaching loaders in low voices. Everyone knew it violated regulations. Everyone knew they could face court-martial if the wrong officer saw it. Then Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams saw it. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion. He was 30 years old, already known for aggressive armored tactics and an obsession with momentum. In September 1944, his only priority was keeping his crews alive. On September 23rd, while observing a training exercise, he noticed a loader turn his back to the breach and complete the motion in under 3 seconds. Abrams immediately halted the exercise. He ordered the crew out of the tank and demanded an explanation. Sergeant Raymond Miller stepped forward and told him everything about Walter's injured shoulder. The desperate improvisation, the faster loading times, the improved survival rates. Abrams listened without interrupting. When Miller finished, Abrams asked one question: "Does it work better than the manual?" "Yes, sir," Miller replied. 2 seconds faster per round, higher accuracy under fire, fewer fumbled shells, better crew coordination. Abrams stood silent for nearly half a minute while every tanker nearby waited. Reporting the violation would mean discipline, possibly charges. But Abrams wasn't measuring compliance, he was measuring survival. Finally, he made a decision that would quietly reshape how his battalion fought. He ordered every loader in the 37th Tank Battalion to learn the backward method immediately. He didn't care what the manual said. He cared about kill ratios and keeping men alive. If turning your back to a 75mm cannon increased survival, then that became the new battlefield standard. Within 48 hours, replacement loaders were being trained in Walter's technique. Abrams brought Walter in to demonstrate the motion step by step, pushing experienced crews to match his 3-second rhythm. There were no official updates to doctrine, no printed revisions, just a practical adaptation born in combat and adopted because it worked. By October 1st, nearly 90% of the loaders in the 37th Tank Battalion were using the backward method in combat. This was no longer an experiment whispered between crews, it was a battlefield shift. Their average engagement time dropped from 12 minutes to 8. Their kill ratio climbed past 1:1. They were losing fewer Shermans, destroying more Panzers, and more crews were driving back from the fight instead of burning in French fields. Other commanders in 4th Armored Division took notice. In a war measured by wreckage, numbers spoke louder than tradition. Some battalions adopted the technique immediately after hearing Abrams explain it. Others hesitated. The manual was still the manual. Regulations existed for a reason. Changing official procedures without authorization could end careers. But this was 3rd Army, and 3rd Army belonged to General George S. Patton. Patton cared about speed and results. When staff officers showed him after-action reports from 4th Armored Division, he asked a single question: Why weren't all his loaders doing this? On October 7, 1944, Patton visited division headquarters and watched Walter demonstrate the backward loading method in person. He watched other loaders repeat it. He timed them with his own stopwatch, 3 seconds, 2.8 seconds, 2.9 seconds. Then Patton gave a direct order. Every tank battalion in 3rd Army would adopt the method immediately. Any commander who refused would be relieved. Any officer who court-martialed a loader for using it would answer to Patton personally. 3rd Army fielded 11 armored divisions, roughly 4,000 Sherman tanks. Within 2 weeks, the backward loading method was standard practice across the Army. Not whispered, not improvised in secret. Official. Training officers demonstrated it to replacements. Veteran crews drilled it into newcomers. The technique spread through formal channels instead of rumor. The results followed. Between October and December 1944, 3rd Army's tank loss ratio improved from 3.2 to 1 against American forces to 1.4 to 1. Sherman crews were destroying German armor faster than it could be replaced. Crew survival rates increased by 18%. The backward method wasn't the only reason tactics evolved, coordination improved, experience accumulated, but it was a measurable factor in the shift. 1st Army and 9th Army took notice. By January 1945, loaders across the European theater were turning their backs to the breach. By March, the technique had reached the Pacific. Tank crews fighting on Okinawa were using the same motion Walter had discovered in desperation in France. Officially, however, nothing changed. Technical Manual 9-731A was never rewritten. On paper, loaders were still instructed to face the breach. The regulations remained untouched. But every experienced commander understood the reality. The manual was theory. The backward method was survival. By the time the war ended in May 1945, tens of thousands of Sherman loaders had used Walter Kowalski's technique. No one knows exactly how many lives it saved, but the numbers suggest it was significant. And what happened to Walter afterward revealed something deeper about how institutions treat unconventional solutions. He received no medal for inventing the method, no commendation, no official citation. Armies do not award decorations for violating regulations, even when those violations change outcomes. He did receive a promotion. On October 15, 1944, Sergeant Raymond Miller recommended Walter for promotion to corporal. The paperwork went through. No ceremony, no speech, just a new stripe sewn onto a uniform still smelling faintly of cordite. Walter remained a loader in the 37th Tank Battalion for the rest of the war. Between October and May, he survived 14 more engagements. His tank was hit 3 times. 3 times he walked away. By war's end, his crew had destroyed 23 German tanks. Walter loaded every round, every shot. Always the same motion, back-turned, hand-guiding body, driving steel into steel. By 1945, he could load a 75mm shell in 2.3 seconds blindfolded. The movement no longer required thought. His hands knew the geometry of the turret better than his eyes ever could. It had become reflex, survival distilled into muscle memory. When the war ended, Walter returned to Detroit, back to the Ford River Rouge plant, back to engines instead of armor. He married in 1947, had 3 children. Worked 41 years at Ford before retiring in 1986. Like most veterans, he rarely spoke about the war. But the method he discovered out of desperation kept echoing long after he came home. During the Korean War, American crews operating modified Shermans against North Korean T-34s were trained in the backward method at Fort Knox before deployment. Combat reports from the 1st Marine Division during the fighting around the Pusan perimeter noted that loader speed often determined survival in close-range tank duels. Marine crews averaged 2.8-second load times, nearly a full second faster than their opponents. It mattered. In Vietnam, even as Shermans faded into obsolescence, the principle endured. Crews operating AMP-148 Patton tanks adapted the same motion for 90mm guns. Turn your back, feel for the breach, ram the shell home. The physics did not change just because the gun grew larger. Even after semi-automatic systems appeared in the 1970s, human loaders still handled rounds manually before feeding them into mechanisms. Variations of Walter's backward grip continued to be taught at Fort Benning into the late 1980s, passed down by instructors who had learned it from men who had learned it in France. In 1993, a military historian researching 4th Armored Division tactics discovered brief references to improved loading efficiency in after-action reports. He tracked Walter down through veteran registries and asked about the technique. Walter shrugged it off, said it wasn't anything special, just something he figured out when his shoulder was hurt. The historian later described it as one of the most significant frontline tactical adaptations of World War II, estimating it may have saved between 300 and 500 American tank crew lives in the European theater alone. That estimate didn't include Korea or Vietnam or decades of training that followed. Walter died in 2004 at age 82. He was buried in Resurrection Cemetery in Clinton Township, Michigan. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II. It did not mention that he had quietly changed how American tanks fought. At his funeral were his 3 children and 7 other men, all veterans, all former tank loaders. None had ever met him before that day. They came because they understood what he had given them. Today, his service record sits in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It lists his rank unit and dates of service. Nothing about innovation, nothing about survival rates. At the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, a restored M4 Sherman stands on display. Step inside the turret, and the truth becomes obvious. The space is tight, brutally tight. When you stand where Walter once stood, you understand immediately why he turned his back. There simply wasn't room to do it any other way. The museum placard describes armor thickness and engine horsepower. It mentions that American crews developed innovative tactics. It does not mention his name. And maybe that's the point. Wars are not won by manuals alone, not by specifications printed in neat columns. They are won by ordinary people making split-second decisions under fire, by mechanics who find better ways to load shells, by soldiers willing to break rules when the rules stop working. Walter Kowalski never called himself a hero. He was just a left-handed kid from Detroit with a damaged shoulder who needed another way to survive. That way saved his life and hundreds of others.